Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Collegian Football Podcast. My name is Justin Morganstein and my partner, Alexis Yoder. Alexis, how are we doing today?
Doing good, Justin. How are you?
I'm doing great. Excited. We're just about a month away from Penn State football. And, as the summer winds down, we are kind of starting to feel football season a little bit. Of course, basketball is over and all the other sports that, carried into the summer a little bit. And now football seems to be on the way, and it's real exciting. And we're going to start to dive into Penn State's schedule a little bit with their first three games. And Alexis, so with the season a month away, of course, Wisconsin is the opener for Penn State, which a lot of people are highly anticipating. What do you think? What are you expecting for that weekend and that game specifically, which is going to be, of course, a huge matchup?
Well, Justin, I think it's worth mentioning that this is the first time Penn State is going to play a ranked team in an opener since they played Miami in 2001. So it's not going to be a walk in the park for the first game like it typically is for their non-conference schedule. They're going to hit a hostile environment, a team that is very, very similar to them. And I think we're gonna have to expect some of their big players to produce right off the bat. The players that have been in these kind of situations before, such as Clifford, Jahan Dotson, Rasheed Walker, their veterans are gonna have to carry them through this hostile environment and through the first game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely agree with you. But I also want to touch on with Wisconsin. They have some quarterback questions as well with Graham Mertz returning. He was expected to be a really big part of their attack last year, of course, and got off to that great start, but then faded a little as the season went on. But he was a top recruit coming into Wisconsin, had offers from pretty much everywhere, Alabama, Florida State, you name it, and they're really expecting him to take a big step next year. So it'll kind of be a matchup between two quarterbacks who were expected to be producing on big levels and have come a little short of expectations so far. So if Clifford can, outduel Graham Mertz, then that would be obviously ideal for Penn State. But of course, you're going to have to deal with their offensive line. And every year it seems that they have these big, husky guys just in the offensive line, just creating giant gaps for the running backs. So, it'll of course be hard to defend that as always, but Penn State will have their work cut out for them. And I think that they'll be able to, if they're able to scheme up a good game plan with Brent Pry and the offensive or the defensive line and the linebackers are able to, stall their run game a little bit, then it'll be a tough game, but they'll have a chance to pull out an important win, what would be a really huge first win of the season. One that, you can't exactly expect them to win. Definitely. But of course, one game that they are expected to win that I think shouldn't necessarily be a lock win is Ball State as the opener. Of course, that's the home opener for Penn State. It'll be the first game at Beaver Stadium on September 11th. But they're a team that, as the returning MAC champions, they are not a team you can sleep on if you're James Franklin and company. They have a stud wide receiver in Justin Hall returning for them from last year. And they just have a lot of returning starters too. 10 out of 11 returning starters on offense. They have some defensive starters coming back from next year. And, they're a tough team, of course. And obviously we saw with Appalachian State in 2018, you can't sleep on those teams that come out of the MAC and are expected to be, competitive, not just in their conference, but nationally as well, and make a bowl game and potentially be a Power 5 team like Penn State. So, that'll be really interesting. And it's a game that Penn State should be expected to win, but you got to run the ball against their defensive line. And, if you have to win ugly, you win ugly. A win's a win. But Ball State's not a team that they should be taking lightly. And but they'll have another big home game the next week, of course.
Yeah, App State, as we saw, we cannot sleep on these kind of teams. That game is one that shall live in infamy. And as you said, an ugly win is better than not winning at all. So, and as you said before, Ball State has 10 out of 11 starters on offense returning. And you can't knock experience at any level in college football, whether you're in a Power 5 conference or you're not. That experience pays dividends. And as we saw last year with Penn State, we saw the opposite happen when their defense was critically inexperienced, and teams just ripped them apart week after week. So, but at the same time, that built up some confidence, and I think heading into the season, this team sounds as confident as ever. So, they should take care of business in their home opener, but once again, Ball State is completely capable of making this a game. And if Penn State doesn't come out on top, it's going to be an uphill battle the next week at home against Auburn.
Yeah, I mean, there's a legitimate chance that if they started, that they could start 0-2, and then you have Auburn. It's coming up to Happy Valley for the first time in maybe ever, and they have a lot of interesting aspects to them too. Of course, they're gonna be coming into a pretty hostile environment with the whiteout. Of course, something that they have not experienced. Of course, being in the SEC, they play in front of some good crowds, but obviously an atmosphere like no other. But they also have a new head coach. Gus Malzahn era is over in Auburn. It is now Brian Harsin, who is the new head coach for the Tigers. And he's a real interesting offensive mind. He worked at Boise State. He worked at Texas as an offensive coordinator. And the way that he'll be able to use Bo Nix will be extremely interesting to see. Of course, he was a huge recruit coming out of high school. And again, kind of like Graham Mertz, like we talked about Wisconsin, has been good, but hasn't really, exceeded or met those expectations. And that Penn State game could be the perfect place for him to finally have that breakout campaign to get it started. So if he could come into Beaver Stadium, into a whiteout, and play well and produce, then that could be a huge kickstart for Harsin and his program. And a lot of Auburn fans weren't happy about the hire. So he's got a lot to prove, and so does Nix. And they'll be looking to do it, obviously, in a place like Penn State.
Yeah, definitely. Bo Nix is a player that's been talked about for the last couple of years in college football. And he's really, as you said, not met expectations, but as you said, expectations for Graham Mertz, for Sean Clifford, for a lot of quarterbacks that had sort of left a lot to be desired of their performances last season have really been improving. Obviously, their coaches have said great things about them and how they've, come into their own. And, this situation is kind of resembling what Penn State's OC position has been resembling over the past couple of years. A lot of inconsistency, but positive remarks nonetheless are coming from about Yursich and how he's been handling the offense. And I think that, against Auburn is going to be their real first test at home in a whiteout environment. And Penn State thrives in that environment, as we've seen year after year. And, nothing really prepares you for the whiteout. I mean, it's one thing if you're Ohio State or Michigan, and you're used to seeing that environment every other year. But Auburn coming in, they're not going to know exactly what to expect, and I think that's going to give Penn State a real leg up against them.
Yeah, something else that I noticed about Auburn's schedule at the beginning of the season, which I thought was pretty interesting, was they have a couple, we'll call them scrimmages, before Penn State. They have Akron and Alabama State, both I'm assuming are at home. And while those are always great tune-up games, and Penn State really could have used those type of games last year when they played the all-conference schedule, Penn State's going to be finely tuned by the time Auburn arrives in Happy Valley. They have two tough games, one in a hostile road environment, and one is a home opener against a team that's coming off a conference championship. So they should be finely tuned by the third game, when Auburn, of course, is, working through their, kinks and other things like that with Akron and Alabama. But of course, so two teams coming in with completely different beginning of the season slates as they meet for the third game. So, I mean, that's an interesting factor, I thought too. But of course, we will see once they match up head to head.
Yeah, definitely. I think personally, I would rather play the tough games first. We've seen how many times Penn State has just made a massacre out of teams like Akron, and of course before that App State almost nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
In what year was that in recent history?
That game in 2018, even though obviously it almost turned out in disaster, that could have been one of the best games I've ever seen. There was just fourth quarter was back, and then they finally take the lead. They come back, and then KJ Hamler makes that miraculous kick return, and then they get the touchdown, and the Amani Oruwariye pick for the win. That was just a memorable game, but yeah, I don't know how many more memories they want to be making out of home openers against MAC teams, but we'll see. It'll be interesting, definitely. Something else I wanted to touch on, transitioning a little bit. We talked about Lonnie White last couple podcasts ago, I believe. And of course, everyone pretty much saw this week he did in fact sign his contract with the Pittsburgh Pirates, signed his deal over his slot value at just over $1.5 million, something he of course would not have seen probably at Penn State. And Alexis, I want to get your take on it a little bit, but it's obviously a tough loss, and it'll be exciting to see what he does in baseball. But obviously, he would have been a real good talent for James Franklin to have in his locker room eventually. But of course, he decided to take the baseball route, and now he's playing with the Pirates, and he will play in the Pirates organization.
Yeah, Justin, I predicted that he was going to get signed for well over what his slot value was, which was estimated around $1 million, maybe a little less, but he signed for pretty much $500,000 over what the slot value was for that pick. But what teenager is going to say no to $1.5 million, especially when it's a chance to play a professional sport? And, we talked about it before. The Pirates aren't, the ideal professional sports organization in pretty much any sport, let alone the MLB. But, Lonnie White will find a way to make the most of this opportunity, and maybe we'll see him playing up with the Pittsburgh Pirates very soon. But yeah, I wish him nothing but the best, and would have been nice to see what he could do at Penn State, but that's just something
Deion
that
Sanders gone.
Yeah.
But also, I know that you did a story this week on recruiting a little bit, and you talked about a new pipeline for Penn State. Of course, they've had a few in recent memory, including, Lackawanna Junior College, but they have one out of high school now that they've been seeing dividends from. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, the school that I examined this week in my article posted on collegian.psu.edu is about the McDonough School. It's a school in Maryland, and one of the big reasons that this pipeline has sort of developed, there's a couple of reasons. First, a recruiter by the name of Kenny Sanders, who was actually employed for 2 stints at Penn State. He was the assistant director of player personnel for a number of years before taking a job at the University of Oregon for 2 years. But he recently made his return to Happy Valley in February, and he's been working in the recruiting department. And if you've been paying any attention to Penn State football recruiting in the last couple months, specifically in July, you can tell that they've really made some positive ground on the recruiting path. And now this class of 2022 is ranked second in the country. Whether that's a direct result of Sanders being hired again, it certainly hasn't hurt their efforts on the recruiting trail. And that was really capped off by the commitment from Danny Dennis Sutton, who is from, as I mentioned before, the McDonough School, which is Kenny Sanders' alma mater. So now and there's a number of players that are already on Penn State's team that are from this school. PJ Mustafer, Curtis Jacobs. There's a number of players that have been successful at that high school level and that are now being successful at the collegiate level. And now there's more targets from the McDonough School: defensive line player Mason Robinson and defensive end Camden Laudenslager. So we're going to have to keep an eye on these players and how Sanders really affects the recruiting path going forward. But it's certain that he has not done anything wrong. If anything, that he's helped them on the recruiting path. And that's something that, that's momentum that they're going to be carrying into further into the future for recruiting. Yeah, especially now that recruits can visit the Beaver Stadium and really get that game day experience. That's unrivaled, as we've mentioned before.
Absolutely. And I think that creating these pipelines, not just the McDonough School, but elsewhere as well, has really become something that Penn State's tried to do a lot more. James Franklin, always used to talk about just dominating the state, dominating Pennsylvania, getting the most important Pennsylvania recruits. But in recent years, I feel like that mindset, whether it was his choice or not, has had to expand. And now they're using Juwan Sider to recruit the state of Florida very heavily. And now they have their pipeline of Lackawanna and the McDonough School. And so, creating these pipelines just intrigues players towards Penn State. And, if they want to keep up these high-rated recruiting classes like class 2022, those are going to be so crucial because the amount of talent that comes out of some of these places is really unmatched. And if they are able to lock those down and have other kids vouching for the program, like a PJ Mustapher, who is, the perfect ambassador, who's so well-spoken and is so team-oriented and just such a friendly dude. And if you can get a guy like him to, be an ambassador for your program at his old school where there's a ton of talent, that is just so beautiful to have if you're James Franklin and the rest of the coaching staff.
And that's not something that PJ Mustapher takes lightly, as he mentioned at Big Ten Media Day. When, Coach Franklin asked him that question, why is this so important to you? He had nothing short of emotions in his answer. He is definitely very passionate about this program, about Penn State University as a whole, and he wants to share that. He wants to make sure that kids that are at his old high school and that are now on their recruiting journey, that they know that this school is legit and that this school is going to be a solid option for them for football, for education, to set them up for the future. That's something that he's really passionate about. And like you said, that's a beautiful thing.
100%. Absolutely. I want to transition now. We are going to do the next installment of our positional previews prior to the season. Today, we're going to be in the trenches, the offensive and defensive lines. We're going to start with the offensive line here, Alexis. The experience is going to be crucial. They have all returning players coming to the offensive line, both returning tackles, which is big time. But I have a feeling that they are going to have to step up in the interior with their guards and center, and that in order for them to be successful, they're going to have to be, a little better than they were last year.
Definitely. You mentioned that both tackles are returning. I really want to highlight the importance of Rasheed Walker. He is due for a huge season. He could have easily entered the NFL draft last year, chose not to, chose to return to Penn State. And that's very important. As we mentioned before, experience makes a huge difference in college football. And, he is going to have to really be the anchor for this offensive line to give Sean Clifford more protection than he's used to, because as we've seen in years past for not only Sean Clifford, but also the running backs, they often don't have much time to make decisions about if we're passing, if we're running, like if there's an option available, we haven't had time to make that option. So we really need to rely on this offensive line, and that definitely starts with Rasheed Walker.
Yeah, and I think especially considering last year, if you go back and watch some of the tape from any of the games, really, when Clifford was back there, obviously he was under pressure, I think from the interior especially. But whenever, that pressure came up the middle, he was always tempted to scramble and run to the outside. And while that was successful sometimes, to me, that's not what's going to make Sean Clifford successful this season. He's going to have to stand back there and be strong in the pocket and deliver balls to his receivers and tight ends. And in order to do that, of course, he needs a clean pocket. And if Drew Scruggs is the type of guy who, if he could step up in the interior, and of course, Mike Miranda making the transition from guard to center is going to be a big factor. If they could just step up and be sturdy and let the tackles, kind of dominate and do their thing with, like we said, Rasheed Walker and Caden Wallace, then they can hold. They can be okay. And this isn't the strongest offensive line, I would say, that Penn State's ever had. But if they can just hold up, do their job, let the receivers get open and Sean Clifford deliver the ball quickly out of his hands, which I think will happen much more with Mike Yurcich, that will allow Penn State's offense to become much more successful.
Yeah, and we've talked before about how there was a drop off in progression for Sean Clifford's collegiate career. And some of it obviously is on him that he hasn't made the best decisions that he could have made, but even in their season opener last year, he threw 2 picks right off the bat. Like, he didn't have much time to operate. Were those the best throws in the world? No, but he did not have the allotted time that you're supposed to have to be able to make those throws, and that is something that's going to have to change, and I believe it will change. This offensive line is not light years ahead of where it was last year, but definitely some improvement. And it's not just about protecting the quarterback, as I said before. Obviously we know the amount of talent in the running back room right now for Penn State, and that's something that they're going to rely on heavily, and that transitions into O-line protection, opening up those holes and making sure that these running backs have room to run, which they can absolutely do.
Yeah, and I also think that you have to give credit to the fact this is the second year with Phil Troutline as the offensive line coach. The players really seem to just love him. I mean, he's a guy that can really just rally an offensive line group around probably every day, and they're just excited to play for that guy. Like, he just seems like he's someone that you get excited to come in and play for every day. And if he can continue to develop and progress along with these offensive linemen, then they could be in for a much improved season. And not that I think they necessarily were terrible last year, but there were times where you could just tell that Clifford was not comfortable in the pocket and that he was just under too much duress. And the same thing with the running backs. There were too many times where they were stopping the backfield, like you said. And if you could just, let the offensive skill players kind of work their magic and let the receivers get open and let Clifford get the ball out of his hands quickly and let the running backs, get hit holes and get to the outside, then, you're doing your job. And will it be perfect? Probably not. But I think if they can just be sturdy, then the Penn State offense should be in for a big season with Yurcich at the helm.
Yes, definitely. Transitioning to the other side of the ball, we're going to take a look at the defensive line. And this is a position where Franklin has really done a lot of work in the transfer portal, bringing in 2 guys with loads of experience in Derek Tangelo and, forgive me if I mispronounce this, Arnold Ebiketie. Please tell me if
Ebiketie.
Ebiketie. Nevertheless, 2 players with loads of defensive line experience at the collegiate level, and that's really where this defensive line is going to come from. That's going to hinge on their performance and if they're able to perform at the Big Ten level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do have a nice mix of, veterans and young guys. One person that I have been extremely high on since the end of last year, where he was really effective for Penn State, Sadisa Isaac. To me, he's in for a huge breakout season. And him also learning last year from Jason Owe, a guy who was athletic and as explosive as can be, despite not getting a sack, which I still don't believe. It's really unreal experience for him. Like, it's someone that he can learn from and develop those athletic traits while he still has, the athletic traits himself and all the football skill to have a monster season this year. There's no doubt can be a future NFL first round pick to me. Like, I believe PJ Mustipher has come up there and said that before. And if he can have production at that defensive end spot and, you get those contributions from the transfers like Ebiketie and Tangelo, who plug in and fill great holes for Franklin, which he said was a goal of his after last season immediately. He said, we're going to treat the transfer portal almost like free agency. We're going to fill some holes and we're going to, do everything we can to make sure that we have that mix of veterans and young guys. Because, and Antonio Shelton transfers to Florida from last year. That was a big loss. But now once you kind of fill it in with those guys, it makes the loss a little less costly, because you don't want to throw a guy like Nick Tarburton, who's still young, in a position where you feel like he's not ready. So I think he did a really good job with just cleaning up the position and making it a real potential strong suit for Penn State.
Yeah, definitely. They're gonna have to rely on their experience at the position with both of those transfers. As you said, Nick Tarburton was a highly rated player when he came into Penn State coming out of high school, but injuries have really plagued his college career up until this point. But from what James Franklin and his teammates, namely PJ Mustipher, have said about him and his progression, they really believe that he is going to have a breakout season. Now, I don't believe he's going to be starting right off the bat, but as he gets accustomed to that speed of play, as we said, obviously the opening 3 games for Penn State aren't going to be ones to take lightly. If he can get in there and get a couple reps right off the bat, then he could be in the running for a starting job halfway through the season.
Yeah, that D line is going to have their work cut out for them against Wisconsin. Comes in with every guy's like 6'8", 300 pounds. I mean, that offensive line.
Yeah, it's just like O-line U there. Let's be honest. Just for years.
Nolan Rucci led for Wisconsin. So, of course, maybe they'll have that in mind. But, but seriously, it actually is a really good litmus test if you think about it for them. I mean, you think about it, that'll be probably the toughest O-line they see all year, maybe with the exception of an Ohio State or maybe an Iowa. But if they can just gain some confidence potentially from that game, get a sack or 2 on Mertz, that could springboard them to, a really good season. And you're going to get a real good idea in those first 3 games, like we talked about in the beginning, what you have there. And if they can come out of those 3 games with some gaudy numbers, and that just builds so much confidence heading into the conference slate. And I think you can expect them to have that confidence. And they're a talented group, there's no doubt about it. And if they can realize just how good they could potentially be, I think that really the sky's the limit for that group.
Most definitely. And I really want to transition into going more in depth about these 2 transfers. Arnold Ebiketie, please, if I mispronounce his name, I'm very sorry. And Derek Tangelo. These are 2 guys that really the coaching staff and their teammates have spoken very highly of every time that they've spoken to the media. I remember I can't remember if it was after the blue-white game or if it was just from one of the weekly media availabilities. I believe it was Curtis Jacobs or somebody at the linebacker position or on defense spoke so highly about Ebiketie, about how sort of fast he is on the outside for his size. He is 6'3", 253 pounds, and he is a menace on the outside, just getting pressure on the opposing team's quarterback. And Derek Tangelo, we saw his performance at the blue-white game. He really held his own against, the opposition for Penn State's offensive line. So I'm very excited to see how much they really contribute to Penn State's defensive line.
Absolutely, Alexis. I think that is a perfect place to end this podcast. We will be back for another edition in 2 weeks. We'll wrap up with linebackers. We'll do both secondary positions. We'll throw corners and safeties in there. But thank you for listening. And just over a month till the season. Get excited. For Alexis Yoder, I'm Justin Morganstein. Thank you for listening.